Okay, I think we've got the majority of people with us. So thank you so much for joining us. Hello and welcome. We are here today to talk about waste, the circular economy, and in particular, the workplace. So the latest research from Tarkett shows that 65% of office workers are more mindful of their impact on the environment now than they were before the COVID-19 pandemic. However, while there's a great desire at 67% of those surveyed to do more to protect our planet, there's confusion about exactly what that means, exactly what they should be doing, and exactly who should be doing some of those things. So I'm author, podcaster, and journalist Katie Tregiddon, and I'm joined by design director and principal at Gensler, Melissa Mizell, co-founder of Nature Squared Lei Kun Tan, and Neil Usher, who is Chief Workplace and Change Strategist at GoSpace AI and the author of The Elemental Workspace. And if you were amongst the first 20 people to register for this webinar and you're here now, keep an eye on your inbox and a copy of Neil's book will be winging its way to you soon. So congratulations on that. We're here today to explore how we might rethink waste in the workplace and how that might help contribute to a more circular economy. So Melissa, I would love to start with you, if I may. Gensler creates workspaces that reflect the values of the businesses that inhabit them. What does this mean from a sustainability point of view? How are those values made tangible or visible?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think that, some people are overwhelmed by sustainability, or they think of it as a checklist, right, of strategies and things like that. But I've found, and we found at Gensler, that the best way to incorporate sustainability is to look at the values of who we're designing for and choose strategies that align with those. And there's a degree of authenticity in that. And so some examples of how we might, do that would be a company's stated interest in health and well-being. Well, then, then we would. This is my coworker here. Then we would. So a stated interest in health and well-being, which is also a recruitment tool, then we would focus on strategies that really kind of overtly speak that language. I worked on a project several years ago where it was a American branch of a Dutch agricultural bank. And so we focused a lot on materials that spoke about, sustainably harvested wood, things that grow in a sustainable manner, because it spoke to them, and it also was sustainable. So as we sort of ramp up, right now we're looking at more aligning our designs with companies' carbon strategies. So we have a lot of work at hand, but I think that this is where sustainability truly works, is when you find that alignment with who you're designing for.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned materials there. What are some of the other ways that you can make these design choices visible?
I think, materials is a big one. And, of course, this today we're focused a lot on using, using waste or keeping waste out of landfill. And so that's a huge thing, right? That's something you could look at and touch, and that this object, this beautiful object, has a history, be it a piece of furniture or be it a wall paneling of wood that's been reclaimed from a floor from somewhere. That's one way. I think another way is also, more about influencing behaviors. So messaging, even being very overt about how you sign compost and waste, and getting people to, enjoy that act of doing it, getting people to, we design airports, right? So getting the mass public to, stop using plastic water bottles and refill their bottles. With very overt hydration stations with signage that, makes you feel good about what you're doing. It's not about being preachy, but it's like, hey, by you doing this, you're, saving, this amount of water bottles. So it's a combination of strategies, but for us, it's really about making those moves noticeable and approachable. and understandable.
Yeah, and it's interesting the way you phrase that messaging. I read somewhere that the sign "people who care about our village stay off the grass" is more effective than "please keep off the grass." And so that sort of idea of people like us do things like this is
Yeah.
really powerful in messaging. Leikun, Nature Squared makes surfaces, and more recently in collaboration with Bethan Gray, furniture and accessories out of natural waste. So you're using things like shells and feathers that are left over from the food processing industry to make these really beautiful high-end materials. What happens when people see what can be done with waste? What's the sort of shift that happens in their minds?
What I love, Katie, is that light bulb moment, you know, when they pick something up and they don't actually know what the material is, and you tell them it's actually crushed eggshell, or it's woven feathers, you know, and it goes ping, really? And that's what we are after at a conscious level, that people look at, you know, what can be done with waste very, very differently. But I think on a less conscious level, you know, it shifts people's perception of what is around them. We are very used to the materials that are, you know, common and historically used in the built environment. So we discount it. You know, yes, of course, that's wood. Yes, of course, that's metal. Yes, of course, that's, you know, whatever it may be. But when they see, perhaps without directly engaging with it, something that is made from an alternative material, I think that broadens their receptiveness. You know, to Melissa's point about how overt and how covert, you know, we would be wanting to target that whole range of very much in your face, look, this tile is made from waste eggshell. It is made of crushed eggshell that has, you know, been diverted from landfill. That's fine. But on the other hand, it's really good when someone sees something and goes, oh, that feels nice, that looks nice, without having, you know, to have their face shoved into it. But for it to make a different point, that this is something that's livable with, that can be part, but can become part of the vocabulary of our built and inhabited environment.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it, that sometimes that message comes, that's made from waste, now what is it? Whereas sometimes it's like, gosh, that's beautiful and I could really live with that. Oh, and it's made from waste. And I think it's, yeah, having both of those options is really interesting. Now, Neil, what we've talked about so far is tangible waste. It's stuff, you know, and I think we're becoming more and more aware of the amount of things that are going into landfill and perhaps what we should do about that. But what about intangible waste in the workplace? Space, heat, light, especially after the pandemic?
Yes, hello, and great to be here. The sort of the biggest waste I see in the workplace is simply empty, underutilized space, and this isn't something that has been sort of, you know, brought on us by COVID in any way at all. We've known about this long before COVID. There's a history of sort of gathering data related to utilization in office space for sort of 20, 30 years pre-COVID. And we've known for most of that time that, you know, it's quite often the case that offices are somewhere around about 50% unoccupied at any point in time during the day. Some of that is due to sort of natural absence, some of it is due to purposeful absence, some of it is just the ebb and flow and the natural comings and goings of people. But when we look at this in terms of peak demand, it's fairly unusual in most city centres for peak demand of any office space to exceed around about 60%, and most averages around about sort of 40 to 50%.
So even at their busiest, they're only 60% full.
So we have this sort of situation really where during COVID, a lot of CFOs and CEOs suddenly realised, you know, gosh, our office is costing us a lot because it's empty. Well, we've been trying to tell the industry they've been half empty for decades. So really, we're only dealing with the second 50%, not the first 50%. We already knew that, but it was tolerated. It was accepted as part and parcel of what we did with an office and how.
And why is it problematic for an office to be empty? Because that, you know, it just bring to life for people why that's wasteful, because it sort of feels less wasteful than something that might end up in landfill, for example.
Because we're consuming energy to support it, to heat it, to light it. A lot of offices and city centres are glass boxes effectively, which are probably one of the sort of least beneficial designs in relation to sort of the different changing seasons. During the summer, we have to spend a lot of time and money and use a lot of energy cooling them. During the winter, the reverse. So consequently, even when space is empty, it is still consuming. It's still a waste of resources. And so consequently, we've tried for many decades to look at strategies for occupancy of space based on greater levels of utilization, getting the most out of the space we actually build and the space that we occupy. But it's something of a sort of perpetual cycle, really. More space gets speculatively built. The demand for space is still calculated in the ways that it used to be. So tenants lease that space that's been speculatively built, and then the whole sort of cycle continually repeats itself. And I think, with a lot of the focus on more hybrid ways of working, people's expressing a desire to be in the office for only a few days of the week rather than potentially at some point every day of the week, means that we're potentially facing the situation where office space, when people do start to return, will be even less utilised than it was pre-COVID. Is that likely to be met with a response around the sort of the repurposing of that office, the redesign, the replanning of that office, and the way that people are determining their presence in the office? We're going to have to see really over the coming years, because that's a very new challenge for our industry. But what we're initially facing is the likelihood that we will see, for some period of time, even lower levels of utilisation than we've seen before.
And I suppose if that utilisation was evenly spread across the week or even the day, you could reduce the space accordingly. But it's not, is it?
It's fairly unpredictable. I mean, I think one of the issues that I think most organisations are facing is that when people consider sort of being in the office 2 or 3 days a week, most people see that as Tuesday and Wednesday. So we're likely, perhaps Thursday if there's something really good going on in the evening. So I think, we're likely to be seeing some sort of, a real struggle with equalising the access to and the usage of that space throughout the week. If we look at the typical levels of utilisation pre-COVID, and we look at the commercial workspace in terms of every available hour, so we look at it 24/7, and then we look at that utilisation. Effectively, most corporate workspace is being occupied for 15% of its available hours, 15. If we actually then think about how it's likely to be used in the months sort of where we'll see people starting to return to that workplace and the sort of early stage occupation post-COVID, that's probably going to be sub 10% in most city centres. So that represents, a really highly significant underutilisation of the built environment.
Yeah, it's bonkers when you put it like that. Now, I love your idea of giving the office an annual review. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this started as a sort of spoof blog post a little while ago, really, but I think there's something in it, which is that, when we hire people, when people join our teams, when they join organisations, when we look at investment in other assets, I've worked for companies in the past who spent a lot of money on those physical assets, like mining companies and things. There's a justification for that asset being taken on in the first place, and it's expected to make a return on its investment. So if we were to approach a workspace in the same way we approach a member of staff, we would have a very clear purpose for the office being there. We'd have some objectives or some targets for the year. We'd want to make sure that we gave it a fair chance to actually perform what we set out for it. And we want to identify at an appropriate point in time when we're doing this sort of annual review, did it meet its targets? What did it do really well? What could it potentially have done better? What learning and development does it need? But what that's playing to is the idea that the office environment needs to evolve and it needs to adapt with the organisation and also with the environment, and needs to be sensitive to the needs of, taking a triple bottom line approach, needs to be sensitive and supportive of the needs of people, the organisation and the environment, and it needs to do all three. And so consequently, there's a usable framework already for assessing, on an annual basis, the contribution of the workplace. Now, I know very few people who do that, or very few organisations that have ever looked at their workplace as an asset in that way, and evaluated it in that way. Does mean gathering data, does mean understanding from people how well it's supporting them, but then actually doing something about it. Because there's no point in having an annual review if you don't actually have some actions that result.
Yes, the dreaded areas for improvement box.
Yeah,
I think it's a wonderful idea. Now, I mentioned in the introduction that research conducted by Tarkett recently has found that 67% of office workers are more mindful of their impact on the environment. But interestingly, at work at least, the emphasis seems to be on the things the company can do. So things like air quality, automatic light and water sensors, and more recycling points around the office, rather than things that are within their own gift of change. So things like cycling to work. Lei-Kun, perhaps I can ask you, why do you think this is? Why is there that sort of imbalance in where people think this action should come from?
It's an interesting one, Katie, isn't it? What I would have been really interested to see is the breakdown of the population that Tarkett was surveying, because I wonder if there is a difference between people who find themselves in a large corporate environment versus, an SME type environment, owner-run type of environments, because I could well imagine, if you work in one of those glass boxes that Neil was talking about, that that your ability to influence that is in reality possibly quite limited. I mean, if you are very active in your views, you might actually get together with a group of colleagues and make a case for change, but the reality is, I think in those large corporate type environments, it is harder. Whereas if you feel that you can contribute to the decision making process more easily, then of course you would do so. I think also it's a question of how inclusive, therefore, the company itself is. I mean, we, for example, to take a very personal illustration, we, partly because that's our philosophy, of course, and we drive it home as far as possible in educating our people. One of the first things we did very, very many years ago was we bought everybody a water bottle. Every employee got a water bottle. When these things were sort of not fashionable, and it was a slightly, odd thing to do. But what we then do in talking to them is also to ask more widely, what of these issues are they taking home to their families? In other words, where do you cross the divide between work and the home environment? Because of course, in many ways, we all do have that partition in our minds and in our lives. But I'm also interested, as we were talking about, more hybrid working and so on, more working from home. Does that line blur? And do our behaviors at work and at home start to merge more than perhaps, they might have done had we not had this COVID-inspired hybrid model?
Yes, I think there's 2 points there that are really interesting. The idea of sort of how much personal agency people have got or feel they've got in the workplace, and also this idea about the blurring of workspaces and home spaces, perhaps therefore meaning some of those behaviours blur. Melissa, I wonder if I could put the same question to you and allow you to build upon Lei-Kun's answer. And I know you were also quite surprised that their aspirations for environmental measures were so modest. So perhaps you could talk about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I'll start out there, and then I do want to build on what Lei mentioned. I was surprised because a lot of the comments were, wanted more recycling, wanted, better paper procurement policies, and like all of those are really great, but we've been talking about them for a long time. And so, I would have expected that, the aspirations would be, I want my company to go carbon neutral. Some of these bigger things. And, I think it might be because of issues like carbon and all that is so overwhelming that people are very focused on, like, what is it that I see? What is it, that I can do? And so, I would say if a company is not being transparent in those basic practices, they got to get with it, right? And then elevate this conversation, because we are kind of running out of time, right? So that's that. But then what this conversation has kind of gone to is, we are now working not hybrid, we're working towards going back to potentially a hybrid work environment. And we know through our own research that, most people are interested in that. They want that freedom of choice. The other thing that we're seeing are people are, as we return to a physical workplace in some capacity, some people are going to be switching jobs. And, I think there's a lot more power for the employees. And that's, I think, what we do in the physical workplace to, lure people back into the office to some capacity, to build culture, to collaborate. There's benefit to that. That's important, but it's important as a recruitment tool. And so, I see that, there's more pressure on companies to live, express their stated values, and you gain new ones, where they need to, in order to attract and retain people. And I want to say one more thing, Neil. You're talking about utilization of space. This pandemic has really taught us that we can't take anything for granted. We don't know what's going to be thrown at us, and so the potential of the office to flex, to change uses. Maybe one day it's more about individual desks, the other day it's more about a group collaboration setting. But it needs to be able to switch on a dime to adapt to those changing uses. And I think that is also a really great sustainability strategy as well that ties into this conversation.
Yeah, I think you make an interesting point about employees sort of having more agency. There was an article, interestingly, in the Observer this weekend about workplaces that stated that 49% of employees plan to resign if they're not given the flexible working that they want after the pandemic. And so I think there's all this stuff we've been told wasn't possible, that people in the industry have been pushing for decades, as Neil mentioned, that all of a sudden it seems we can do. And the role of the office is certainly going to have to change. But Neil, I wanted to talk to you about some of the sort of systemic and industrial level issues, because this isn't all about personal agency. And just for one example, something that you shared with me when we spoke before this, which I wasn't aware of, is that only new buildings can qualify for BREEAM's excellent rating. So for anyone who's not familiar with the term, BREEAM stands for the Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Method, and describes itself as the world's leading sustainability assessment method for master planning projects, infrastructure and buildings. And yet the environmental impact of whatever was knocked down to build that new build that's just got excellent rating isn't taken into account. Now, surely adaptive reuse would be more environmentally responsibility and certainly less wasteful. So why is that not being encouraged by these sort of big industry bodies?
It's actually, just to clarify, my understanding is it's the outstanding rating, which is the new one, or the newest rating. Yeah. Just for some clarity. Now, look, I'm not an expert in this by any means, so I should caveat that. But what I do find fascinating are sort of payback periods for investment in sort of environmentally sustainable environments, because I've seen up to sort of 80 years being quoted as a payback period. So I think something that we all have to answer really is what payback period will we accept for as viable for environmentally high performing buildings, environmentally responsible buildings. I think if there's an opportunity to reuse, it should always be evaluated. Sometimes there's some character and some reason for retaining buildings. Other times we're dealing with, potentially poorly performing buildings. Should we let something limp on and just, sort of patch it up if actually it could be taken down and something more environmentally responsible could be put in its place? And this presents a huge difficulty for us. How far back do we go? Do we look at the previous building that we have to demolish? Do we try and get some records on the one that was demolished before that? There's got to be a point in time that we potentially would go back to. But I think that any redevelopment that requires the demolition of an existing building should take into account the environmental impact of the demolition in the first place, and that should be part of the whole scheme. If it's not, it should be. And I think we really need to be incredibly sensitive in terms of things like energy and use as to what we think payback periods are likely to be. Most commercial buildings have got a sort of dual replacement lifetime in relation to plant and systems, so probably sort of 50 years or so. So you're probably going through that process twice. But certainly with outstanding buildings, they have to be built and designed in a very different way from even an excellent building or a lower rating from that. Hence the need to achieve that standard to actually create a new building on that piece of land. So I think we've got some issues that really need to be understood, and I think tenants need to understand that as well when they're leasing buildings. They need to understand what process has been gone through, not just be told that it's got a certificate, but actually what happened to create that building, what happened to bring that into being. Was there an opportunity to reuse, to recycle the building was there in the first place before that decision was taken? What is the payback on the construction period for that building? So I think tenants all need to be much more environmentally responsible buyers of space in that sense, and to understand the life cycle, the intended life cycle of that building, to what was there before, to how long that building is expected to last, and the way it's intended to perform over its life as well. Because a lot of the time, those people that are actually pursuing the accreditations, those people who are sort of checking that, who are going through that process, will produce a certificate, but nobody really in most organizations understands what that means in relation to that organization's environmental targets. Back to what I was saying earlier, it's all very well having an outstanding rated building that is hugely environmentally responsible if it's only being utilized for half of it for 50% of the time during the normal working day and only 15% of its available hours. So we really have to relate the sort of physical construction and how environmentally it's been constructed to how sustainably it will perform in use over a period of time. So a lot of fairly big, crunchy issues for us to deal with, I think, as an industry in that respect. It's not just a case of walking in the reception, seeing an environmental certification and sort of ticking a box in our own mind and thinking that it's all fine. It's hugely more complicated than that.
Yeah, and I think those timelines are really important to understand, because if a building's payback is 80 years, if it gets knocked down after 20 years because someone decides they want something different, then it hasn't achieved that payback. And also, as Melissa mentioned, we don't have 50 or 80 years to tackle climate change, so we've got to be looking at some shorter wins. But as you say, a lot of buildings do have to be demolished for one reason or another. Melissa, tell us about Gensler's materials matchmaking pilot that is aiming to address some of the waste generated by demolition. I'm really interested to hear more about this.
Yeah, so Gensler's got a lot of offices. We have a lot of employees. We're all over the globe. We touch a lot of projects. New buildings, and a lot of existing buildings. That's a huge part of our work. And we realize that we're in a position where we can take responsibility for a lot of this work. Things get pulled out of some projects. They may have a 5-year lifespan, and then they get ripped out, right? So this is something we've been grappling with for years, and we're not alone in this, right? A lot of our partners are in the same boat. But one thing we realized is, we can play matchmaker, and so we're just embarking on a pilot program with right now, just within Gensler. And it's called Salvage, G for Gensler. And the idea here is to create a platform that allows us to track materials that are coming from different projects, right? And then to let others know that these materials are available. I mean, it could be furniture, it could be finishes. There's a posting right now for carpet, and to help make these connections. What we want to do is we want to grow this. And so we are talking to other partners outside of Gensler, a really fabulous demo contractor who's doing the same thing. A lot of people in the furniture world are looking at these things, but it's really about connecting these dots, because much of this stuff really it's good stuff, And if we could keep it out of landfill and use it in projects, some of it just may go in and nobody notices, and others, really may be this beautiful artifact of, a beautiful piece of furniture. But we realized that, over different product categories, this actually can help us a lot with our carbon challenge, right? We've also, as a firm, we want all of our projects to go carbon neutral by 2030. That's a huge goal, right? But we're all working towards that, and I think this is one way. So anyway, it's new, but I'm really excited by it. I think one of the authors of this idea is on the call today, so I just want to give it a shout out because I think it's cool. And
yeah, I mean, my last book was profiling people who make things from waste, sort of designers and makers who are using waste as a raw material. And the biggest question I get asked is, but how do I find the waste? Because I think often it's only when companies have found a solution to the waste problem that they're prepared to talk about it. And, I have been hunting for something like this that allows people who've got waste to post it, and people who need resources to post that and then get connected. So I think this is an exciting pilot, and I look forward to hearing where it goes. Right, I've got 2 or 3 more questions for my panel, and then we're going to have some chance for you guys to put some questions. So I can see there's one in the Q&A already. If you've got a burning question, pop it into the Q&A now. If you haven't got one yet, as we're talking, start thinking and pop the questions in there, and I will put them to our panel in a couple of questions' time. Lei Kuhn, I know you were quite shocked that 1/3 of the participants in the research felt they were doing everything they could for the environment. Do you think that's because they feel powerless in the face of kind of big systemic barriers, of the complexity of the carbon problem? Or do you think they feel they're separating their recycling and that's quite enough? Thank you.
Probably a bit of both. I think the problem is that from nobody talking about sustainability, when we started 20 years ago, nobody was talking about it really, other than a couple of geeks like us, to today, when it's a term that's bandied around so easily. And it's a complex topic. I mean, hearing Neil and Melissa speak, and it's such a multifaceted topic. But one of the things that struck me, Katie, when you and I were talking earlier is, we were both quite shocked that people could think that the plastic issue was bigger than the carbon issue. And I think that exemplifies the confusion out there, which is understandable in people's minds, because, it's not quite what you read last or what you watched last is the thing that stays biggest in your mind. But nevertheless, I think it's very difficult for people to weigh up all these very, very large issues that they face, all of which have some environmental bearing, but, some so massive, like the carbon issue, that really it's almost inconceivable that people wouldn't see that today. But there are people who do not see it clearly. I mean, you see that on the political scene and elsewhere. But also, I think when issues are so big, the question is, what can I do that's going to make a difference, or going to make a big enough difference? And then the minute there is a barrier to it, the minute it becomes that little bit difficult or challenging to change a well-entrenched behavior, then I think that people will go back to, well, I will separate my paper, my cardboard, my tins, and that will do me. And bear in mind that there are lots of societies in which even doing that is a challenge, right? That you have to be really motivated to do that. So I am very sympathetic to people who feel that they want to do more, but find that it's practically difficult to achieve.
Yeah, and I think the difference between plastics and carbon is interesting. So not when we were talking, we couldn't remember whether we'd seen that in this research or other research, but people felt that the plastics crisis was more important or more urgent than the carbon crisis. And I think in some ways plastic's just much more tangible, right? I can give up plastic straws, I can give up single-use plastics, I can feel I've done my thing, whereas carbon is complicated, intangible. Melissa, now I'm not asking you to account for all Americans, but this figure of people feeling they were doing all they could was highest amongst the Americans surveyed. Why do you think that is?
All right, I'm going to wager a guess. I think it might have something to do with, you know, sustainability is super complex, and you know, once you start like really unraveling it and trying to understand like all the different aspects of it, from like waste to, you know, chemicals to carbon, you know, it just becomes more and more complex and overwhelming in many ways. You got to like stick to it to just like, you know, not get overwhelmed. And I think what happens is like the more you know, the more you realize you just don't know anything. And that's
there's that wonderful quote, isn't there? Wisest is she who knows what she does not know.
Yeah. And so it could be that, right? Where people are like, yeah, I'm recycling, I'm doing everything I can, like I got it. Maybe that's it.
Yeah. And I guess those countries that are further ahead on their journey, because I think the Scandinavian countries, I think it was Sweden that had the lowest amount of people who felt they were doing all they can. And you think, gosh, you guys are probably doing more than anybody else, but they've probably got a better understanding of what needs doing. Now, Melissa, I know you've lived in Japan as well as the States, and Lei Kun, you live in London, work in Zurich and produce in the Philippines. I think I'm correct with all those countries. And the data from Tarkett's research came from Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, France, and the UK. What can we learn from the way different countries are responding to the environmental crisis? Melissa, perhaps if you want to go first, and then I'll come to Lei Kun.
Yeah, I love this question. You know, when the one thing I noticed in Japan, everybody who goes to Japan, you know, they're always like overwhelmed by how beautifully packaged everything is, right? First, and then they're like, oh my God, but there's all this waste, right? And so people kind of fixate on that. But then when you start to like really look around, what you see also is that, well, you know, I lived in Tokyo, right? So there's a really great public transportation network and everyone's using it, right? You know, not everybody has a car. Not everybody needs a car. You know, the homes are a little bit smaller. And then I was super impressed by this. You know, people hang their laundry out to dry, which saves a ton of energy, right? And so it's like, kudos, you know, that's great. Like everybody learned from that. And you know, when I look at the United States, you know, I do think, even though we tend to obsess about things like, you know, disposable straws and all that, you know, there's a really nice attention to waste, and you know, I think, okay, you know, like let's learn from that. And Lei Kun, you've had way more global experience, but you know, my feeling is that if we really open our eyes, we can learn so much from other countries.
Take that attitude rather than criticizing what other countries aren't doing well, sort of to take the positive and see what we can learn.
Yeah, bring it home as a souvenir and start practicing it.
Yeah. Lei Kun?
Can I just add something here, which I think, you know, one of the things we touched on it to a degree with office space, but we talk a lot in environmental terms about recycling, about waste, about sort of reprocessing, etc. But actually, the biggest problem we have is demand. It's actually wanting the stuff in the first place. It's not wanting it means we don't have to deal with it when we don't want it anymore.
When you say demand, do you mean kind of consumption of overconsumption at the beginning of the process, or a lack of demand for the recycled products?
The demand for it in the first place, the demand for more, and actually when we look at our own lives and the contribution we can make, it's not just a case of sort of dealing with what we have. It's actually questioning what we want. That is one of the sort of the biggest issues we need to deal with personally. But I think we can make all of these challenges quite meaningful for ourselves. It's, you know, when I work with organizations, I usually find the way they talk about environmental issues hugely complicated, and they don't seem to use sort of everyday, don't seem to relate it to us in everyday fashion. I liken it almost to, you know, rather than telling you how many calories a chocolate bar will add to your sort of daily intake. I like it when it's expressed as what I would have to do to burn it off. So this chocolate bar equals a 5-mile run. Okay, I can get my head around that, you know, so I can determine whether
maybe in that case I won't eat it, right?
We're more likely to make a decision if we can relate it to something that we can understand in that sense. And so I think we just, you know, we can speak in a much clearer language about these things. We can relate it to things that mean something in our lives rather than sort of data and stats that don't really mean much to us. So give it to us in comparative terms. You know, the difference between, you know, we always talk within Ghostspace about sort of how many miles we would have to drive in a car to what's the equivalent mileage in a car to wanting your own desk in an office every year. You know, those sorts of things actually start to mean something to us. If we tell someone how much carbon is consumed by you wanting your own desk in an office assigned to you, who the hell understands that metric in terms of relating it to something meaningful? Virtually nobody will. So we have to make these things meaningful to us.
It's interesting that the argument against that is often, oh, but it's too complicated to calculate carbon footprints, and there's lots of different ways of measuring them. I mean, those things apply to calories, right? Calories are not a perfect measure. The traffic light system that on food, 5 a day, none of these things are perfect measures, but we've managed to find ways in the obesity crisis to communicate them. And I think you're right. I think we need similar sort of messaging. Right, I've got a ton of questions coming in from the audience. So Laikun, did you want to quickly reflect on the sort of differences between countries and what we can learn, and then we'll go to audience questions?
Yeah, actually, I mean, what I will say is to agree wholeheartedly with what Neil has just espoused, you know, which is one, of course, it's about consumer demand, but two, it's also what's the incentive and how can I relate to it? So in Switzerland, for example, what we have, because it's on a community level, which is the same as a borough level, if you like, in this country, depending on how much does not go into landfill, depending on how much recycling is actually done, you see that as a reduction in your local taxes in the following financial year. You know, so people immediately draw that good behavior equals money in my pocket. I'm very sorry, that's a very blunt tool, but and you know, it is also a society that in any case has already a generation ago completely bought in to the values and the need for environmental protection. But the fact is, it is a great incentive. It's a very direct one, and it's one people respond to. You know, I've seen friends stamping on their empty tins to make them, you know, really, really flat.
I do that.
My weight doesn't do much to it.
We've got a ton of questions. I've got two that are sort of connected. So Katie Balter has asked for a bit more information about how Salvage works. Being conscious of warranties, making sure clients get full value, and whether there are partners that Gensler works with to make sure those pieces go to the best possible place for them. And Rachel also asks, how do we deconstruct buildings to enable that second life for materials so they're not getting trashed in the deconstruction process? So Melissa, perhaps you can talk a little bit more about Salvage and cover off both of those two questions.
Sure, yeah, and you know, let me just explain too that, you know, Salvage, it's in its infancy.
Sure. These jumped on it, like you've got all the answers.
We don't have all the answers yet, but you know, we are just jumping in, not just jumping in, but you know, we are testing it on ourselves. We are at the same time talking to partners who are also grappling with this, because there's probably a lot of synergies there, and you know, we can make a bigger effort than that. You know, all the issues about warranties and all of that, I can't answer that right now. But you know, it's one of those things, right? There's so many questions that come up. In many ways, for us, it's almost like, oh my God, how can we ever make this work? But you know, we are excited. Like so far, it is working, but it still has a lot to go. So you know, maybe this time next year we can circle back on that. I think everybody on this panel has an opinion about materials for demolition, right? How do you, I forget exactly how you phrase that, but you know, one thing is making sure you can actually disassemble things easily, right? You know, when things are just sort of glued together and it becomes this muck of materials that you can't separate, you can't do anything with, right? So you know, how we design is the first step, like designing so that you can take it apart. But then, you know, are you able to take it apart? Is there a market for it? You know, talking to my colleague yesterday, we were just talking about leases, and you know, in the United States, and in many ways, it's a barrier to you know, to the demolition process and making sure that things that get ripped out, you know, get reused. So it's actually rethinking an entire system. I know I jammed a lot into that answer.
No, that's fantastic. And I think, you know, these questions are questions you will be answering as part of that pilot. So that, you know, that's what pilots are for. Yeah. And there are increasing models. There's a model or a business called Hearth in the UK that allows you to rent furniture, for example. So that's one way of sort of keeping things in use. But what you were just saying then about considering things in the design phase feeds into another question. So Tom asks, what are the key attributes that product manufacturers need to think about in creating end-of-life solutions for their products? So I don't know if Lekun or Neil would like to take that one. What is it designers need to be thinking about at the beginning in order to make the end kind of more sustainable?
I'm happy to have a first go, and I'm sure Neil can add to it. When we are making things, of course, we think about, you know, end of life in terms of each input that goes into it. You know, to Melissa's point about putting things together so that you want sort of, you know, you have one lot of gunk that can't be recycled, can't be repurposed at the end of it. So I would say it starts with, what are your base inputs? You know, clearly you should also be looking at the carbon footprint of your inputs, right? And then in the design process, in terms of manufacturing, the manufacturing processes themselves, disaggregating each step of it, having a think about the energy consumption, obviously, of each step, the material consumption of each step, the emissions and the waste from each step, and then finally to eventual end of life. How is this going to be recycled, repurposed, everything?
I think there's a difficult thing, isn't it? Because when you're designing something, I spend a lot of time interviewing designers and makers about this stuff. You're designing something, you're not thinking about the moment it gets put into landfill. You know, you're kind of getting excited about the family that's going to sit around that table, or the person that's going to use that office chair. And I quite often say to designers, but what happens at the end of its life? And they'll say, oh, it'll get passed down through generations. And I'm always like, okay, great, but then what? You know, then what happens in 1,000 years when tables are no longer a thing? And I don't mean ego in a kind of negative sense, but it's a threat to the creative ego, right? You've created this thing, and we're asking you to think about how to dispose of it before it's even left your studio. I can see why it's a sort of a psychological barrier, I guess, that we need to get over. Neil, did you want to come in on that question before I go to the next one?
I think the ultimate responsibility would be that the product manufacturer takes it back again. And be responsible for it, rather than it being sort of passed off somewhere else, really. And I think the other thing really is end of life. I mean, it depends on how long it's intended to last, how long its life really is. We've all acquired things in the past which we think will last us for a long time, but actually last us for a surprisingly short time. And in our frustration, we usually sort of throw it away or discard it in some way. But actually, I think if all manufacturers were to ask themselves the question, what would we do with it if at the end of its life it was returned to us, then that would probably help focus a response.
And it certainly incentivizes the design of those products then in a way that they can be reused. And it's interesting to see even IKEA starting to do this actually. So change is definitely in the air. Heather asks, can we see the research? Yes, you can. It's going to be uploaded into I'm just going to double check, have that answer in my brain. It's going to be uploaded onto the Great Indoors platform. So it will be there and you will be able to see it. And she also asks, how can we get more information to individual designers and architects for their day-to-day work? So I guess, you know, not all architects work for big firms like Gensler, right? There's a lot of independent, small companies, both interior designers and architects and product designers. How do we sort of disseminate some of this thinking to all of those types of people, other than through events like today, of course? Anybody got any thoughts on that one?
Well, that's a
sorry.
Okay, go ahead. No, you go ahead, Lakoon.
All I was going to say was, you know, most of the designers and specifiers and architects with whom we work are very self-motivated about educating themselves and keeping themselves at the forefront of most issues. That said, I think there is also a value in producers and suppliers, you know, talking to a broad agenda, a broader agenda than just, oh, this is what you're looking for, you know, is this fit for purpose? Is this the right color, texture, dimension, weight, whatever it may be, you know, going beyond, above and beyond, you know, the relatively narrow questions that might be answered. From my own experience, I will say this, you know, until very recently, we never, ever talked beyond what was absolutely necessary, because we were very conscious of the time pressures on our audience. But what we have found is that the designers and specifiers are increasingly asking those questions themselves, which is terrific.
Yeah, I love this question. You know, there are a lot of people who, you know, they just, and me included, right? Like, you know, we just feel overwhelmed by how much there is to know, and we're fearful of making bad decisions. And you know, there are a lot of bad decisions to be made. But I think a useful tool, besides curiosity, right, is not being afraid to ask really, really stupid questions, and a lot of questions. And a great place to start is actually when you have conversations with anybody who's representing a product, right? You know, talk to them and you know, like, ask how it's made, ask about raw materials, like, you know, just ask and ask. And what I have found is that sometimes the people I'm talking to don't even know the answers, but often they go when they find out, right? But you learn so much, and in asking those really, you know, stupid questions, naive questions, however you call them, it opens up the door for more questions and better questions. But you know, this fear of, you know, asking stupid questions or making bad decisions, it actually holds us back. So I think that's the most useful tool that anybody can have, is just like get out there and just ask and talk.
Yeah, and I think asking those questions, almost, I'm vegetarian now, but I went through a phase of only eating sustainably sourced meats, and I would make a point of always asking the waitress where the meat came from. Even if I was pretty sure she was going to have no idea, I wanted her to go back to the kitchen and go, you know, people keep asking where we're sourcing our meat from. And so I think sometimes it's not necessarily because you're going to get to the answer, but just to get the sense that people are starting to ask these questions. And I think that can be just as powerful. Neil, do you have any last thoughts before we wrap up?
I was just going to say on that particular question, you brought up the sort of the subject of food there, and I think the optimistic sort of view really is that we were very successful with increasing collectively our awareness about what we were eating, where it came from, why we're doing that. Which means I think, you know, we've proven that through sort of multimedia and multi-layered conversations that we can raise that awareness. We just have to do that with a lot more things than food, but I think it's ultimately possible.
Brilliant. And on that note of optimism, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much to Neil, Asher, Melissa, Mizelle and Lei Kun Tan for being a fantastic panel. I think we've had a really interesting discussion. I'm sure we could talk all afternoon about this stuff, but I'm very grateful for the insights that you've shared. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.